you're going to do it, the audit should be worth it. The problem is, audits are hard. Yet we've issued over 20,000 reports to 2,000 clients worldwide.
It's like trying to get a bunch of kids dressed in the morning. You know, you go and you get one, but one was around the corner and you didn't get his shirt tucked in and they all get into the minivan. Like, it's the same way trying to patch a whole bunch of virtual machines.
Cybersecurity and compliance will no longer be a mystery. Hey everyone, welcome into our cybersecurity mission. My name is Allie Krings. I'm going to be your host. We have Jeff Pochily joining us here, and we're talking all about vulnerability management. How are you?
I'm good. I'm great. How are you today, Allie?
I'm so good. I love sitting down, chatting all things cybersecurity, but before we get into vulnerability management, let's talk about you. How long have you been with Kirkpatrick Price?
I've been with the company 5.5 years.
Okay, and what do you do?
I'm a lead practitioner. So I do both work with clients, so I go to their sites, evaluate their controls, their security environment, but I also work internally with new auditors and new employees to get them prepared to do that same kind of work.
So before you were here, what led you to get to this point? What sparked your interest in cybersecurity?
Well, I spent 20 years working in IT and healthcare, and data security has always been important in healthcare. And so as I moved through that role, it just became a bigger and bigger component. And when I left my last company, I started thinking about the parts I liked the most. Cybersecurity just stood out to me, and the opportunity came up to work with lots of companies and help them improve their cybersecurity posture. And I thought it was a great idea.
But actually in college, you studied to become an electrical engineer.
Well, that's true.
Okay, but it wasn't a fit?
There's a lot of math in electrical engineering, and I didn't want to learn it all. You
know what? I'm a journalism major, so like I'm right on there with you. I took the highest level of math is stats, and I think we're doing just fine, don't you think?
Yeah, I'm really happy letting the computers do the math.
So with that being said, we're going to dive right on into vulnerability management, and we're just going to start with the most basic here. What is a vulnerability?
That's a great question. So a vulnerability is we build our computer systems and our networks with the idea that what is inside them should stay inside them. And the things that are outside should not have access to those things. It's just like your house. You have windows and doors, and you close the doors and you close the windows, and you probably lock them when you leave. A vulnerability is a hole in your house's exterior that would let somebody in that you didn't know about. And the same thing happens in our computer systems, except they're a lot more complicated because there's software running on the computers, there's hardware that the computer software is running on, there are cables, there are actually doors and windows that protect where those computers are running. So any sort of hole that exists, whether it's in software or hardware or doors, that presents an opportunity for someone to access information that they weren't supposed to be able to.
So I want to ask the most basic question here, so bear with us for whoever's joining us. Is it possible then to have zero vulnerabilities?
Well, it's probably not possible to have zero vulnerabilities.
Okay.
Your goal is to address all the vulnerabilities that you know about. The reality is that there are always people looking for vulnerabilities. It's actually a really lucrative market, both for people who should not be looking for vulnerabilities, maybe they have ill intentions if they find them, but also for people who have good intentions finding them. Maybe they're looking for vulnerabilities so that companies can fix them. So there's lots of places where we just didn't know. And it'd be the same, like if we look at that house example, maybe you never knew that I have chickens.
Okay.
And so in my chicken coop, I didn't know that there was a spot. I thought it was small enough that nobody could get in there, but a raccoon did get in through it and was able to get to one of my chickens. And so that was a vulnerability in my chicken coop. And this happens in our computer networks too, where maybe we thought that the way we left something configured wasn't a big enough opportunity for anyone to take advantage of. However, those could be discovered later on, or maybe researchers might find that there are ways to take advantage of those vulnerabilities that are more detrimental than they thought they were.
So in the chicken coop, I assume we have the hole patched up now, right?
Yes, yes.
How often should we be looking for that vulnerability again, or should we always be looking for a new hole? Do we have to confirm that the raccoon can't get back in? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a continuous process.
Okay.
Because the reality is there's two things that are happening all the time in our environments. We're changing our software and we're changing our hardware. And so that can always introduce new vulnerabilities. The people who write the software that we install, they're trying
Right.
really hard not to introduce new vulnerabilities, but they might in the changes that they make because they're working really fast to keep up with their competition, and they're making changes quickly. But also, things that have been around for decades, software-wise, new vulnerabilities could be discovered in them. And so we constantly have to be listening to the industry and to the people who make the software so that when someone discovers a vulnerability, they tell the world through the different channels they communicate through, and we're hearing it. And so we can go and fix our stuff.
So how are they discovering these vulnerabilities?
Yeah.
Or how can you discover your own vulnerabilities?
Yeah, you're probably not going to like be the first person that discovers them. There's
Yeah.
a whole career around being a security researcher. They're doing more math than the electrical engineers are, if you think about it. Like, they're very smart people. They know how to poke and prod and read, different lines of code. And in some cases, I was just reading about a vulnerability that got down to like machine code and processors. So there's a whole bunch of people that are really good at finding those vulnerabilities. And then when they do, they go through a process of telling first the company that the vulnerability is part of their product, and then eventually telling the whole world so that everybody who uses the product can go fix that vulnerability. And the goal is that the security researchers, and we could call them the good guys, they get the news out to the industry in such a fashion that we all have an opportunity to fix it before the bad guys who maybe want to take advantage of the hole for their own financial or other kind of gains.
Sure.
Find out about how to take advantage of it. It doesn't always happen in that order, and sometimes we find out about the vulnerabilities after they did, and we need to move even faster.
So when you're talking about the good guys, spreading the word, is that in a newsletter? Is that on a website? I mean, where is that coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I usually recommend that people first, you need to know everything that's running in your company.
Okay.
So like you have software and you have hardware, and you have different operating systems.
Yep.
So you want to have a decent inventory that's going to tell you, what could be at risk in your organization. And then you can subscribe to all those companies' newsletters. They all have security newsletters where they will send out announcements, and they'll tell you, there's been an update to our software because of this vulnerability, or there's this vulnerability, and you should take this action. There are also industry news subscriptions you can get on, some from the U.S. government, some from independent industry organizations, and they'll let you know about all of the major vulnerabilities across the industry. And depending on the severity, you might hear about the vulnerability from many sources. So the idea is that you want to get that industry monitoring in place for everything that might impact you, and then check it like at least once a week.
How or what makes a company susceptible to these vulnerabilities?
It's not necessarily through anything that a company does wrong.
Okay.
You can pick all of the best software, and many companies have. You can install it, and you can install it for all the right reasons, and then we can discover down the road that some of the best software had a vulnerability in it that may have allowed your adversaries into your network for some period of time. So it's not a matter of did the company do necessarily the right or wrong things, that would result in them being vulnerable. But doing the right things makes it less likely that you're going to have damage that will be of a greater concern than if you did a bunch of the wrong things.
Is it overwhelming when, a company gets audited maybe for the first time and they're just learning for the first time they have all these vulnerabilities? Walk us through that process and what that can be like.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's the basics of vulnerability management are pretty ingrained into like the typical IT administrator's mindset, but thinking about them from a more critical level is usually the area where we're doing the most education. The example that comes to mind is we tend to want to say like, oh, because we do this well, we don't have to do this over here. But one of the concepts that are really important is that we have multiple layers of vulnerability management in our organization, so that even though we do this well, if this wasn't effective, the fact that we do this other thing over here is going to prevent this vulnerability from being a challenge for us. And I think one of the things I encounter the most is that companies will feel comfortable with just this component
Yeah.
and not doing this extra component. I wouldn't even say extra, this necessary second component.
Yes. So can you give us some like real world examples of maybe what you've seen clients or other companies do to help first probably identify those vulnerabilities and then how they've been able to fix it?
The simple first step most companies are going to go through is just making sure that they're applying the updates that come from their computer software vendors to their computers in a timely fashion. And this is challenging for almost any company that has a large number of computers and a large number of servers, simply because, I mean, it's like trying to get a bunch of kids dressed in the morning. You know, you go and you get one and you get all their shirts tucked in, but one was around the corner and you didn't get his shirt tucked in, and they all get
Yeah.
into the minivan and you get to school and there's a shirt that's not tucked in. Like, it's the same way trying to patch a whole bunch of virtual machines with software patches, because you know, you did this one and this one and that one, and when that one was rebooting, you were doing this one and this one, and you got done with all of them, and there were two that it didn't work on, but you didn't notice.
Right.
And so this is a challenge I see most of the time in organizations. And the next logical step is, you know, finding tools that will help them to do that patching, to get those first steps in place, so that, you know, they can feel pretty reliable that that's happening, but also start talking about some of the other steps that come after that.
So a lot of what you're talking about is, you know, on the company-wide hardware, software, servers, right?
Yeah.
What about, I mean, let's just say this is a made-up company. Let's say this company has 50 people and everybody has their own laptops that they work from. If one person doesn't update their laptop when it says that, hey, you know, it's time to update your software, does that pose a risk to the entire company? Or can they be put under a threat or a vulnerability by somebody, you know, maybe even unknowingly putting them at risk?
Yeah, that's actually, you know, a big challenge for companies is that, you know, they think about perhaps maybe, oh, you know, we keep all of our data over here in these servers, so these laptops that our employees are using, they're not quite as critical, so we won't worry about them as much. But what we know is that when adversaries enter companies, it's most often going to be through an employee's laptop or workstation, and then they'll spend time there finding their way to get into the next step. So it is really important that even that one laptop gets updated, and the company doesn't overlook the laptops, and does its best to make sure that there isn't just like, you know, one out there. And that is something we commonly see. I think if I were to poll the other auditors in the company, we'd find the same thing, is that often we'll find laptops that aren't being maintained. It doesn't happen as much as it used to because, you know, companies like Microsoft and Apple have worked really hard to make sure their laptops patch themselves as often, as quickly as the companies will let it happen.
You know, are there, you know, procedures or policies that a company can put in place to help mitigate those vulnerabilities that just a single employee could expose them to?
Yeah, definitely. So education, I think, is a key component to vulnerability management. It's maybe, you know, one of those first soft control steps is to make sure that employees understand their role in vulnerability management, and that is, you know, we're not installing software on our laptops that our company hasn't authorized, and the IT people haven't had a chance to say like, oh yeah, this is appropriate software, it's secure. And then all the things that security awareness training tells us about, like, oh, we're not clicking on links in email, and we're not, you know, opening files we weren't expecting, because that's like the first layer of defense, where perhaps if there are vulnerabilities on that workstation, or if there are vulnerabilities on the network or the server, you know, that first step of letting somebody in is really important. If we go back to the house, that's the teenager that left the door unlocked that allowed someone to poke around inside the house.
Yeah.
You know, that's a real challenge.
You know, and I think when you talk about those individual emails, I think so regularly, seems like maybe, gosh, every couple weeks or something, I'll get an email to my personal account, right, that says something like, oh, your new work schedule is up, or, you know, make sure you check this out, or sign up for this upcoming program. And they're all these, you know, scams, but how can you ensure that your team is properly educated so they're not feeding themselves into those, you know, kind of dangerous waters?
Yeah, continual examples being sent to the team is a really great idea, so they see they're not the only ones receiving these emails, and this is what the emails look like. And then just sort of trying to foster a culture of healthy skepticism about emails. every company has a culture,
Yeah.
and we have a way that we communicate with each other, things that sound right and things that sound wrong. And that could be the first clue is like, if I have never communicated with this person from this team about my work schedule, and suddenly they send it to me, that would be something that should set off some alarms.
Right.
But you can't always rely on that. They're getting really clever in the way they send those emails, and they can be very convincing. So the goal is just like, be very skeptical,
Yeah.
and be very cautious. And like I think it'd be great if we could teach every employee in every company to be super suspicious of anything that comes in email, that could have any risk to them at all. But that's going to be a challenge, and that's where we're talking about those other layers are still very important.
So I know that somebody who maybe is getting their first audit or joining us today, it is really intimidating learning about how your company probably has vulnerabilities, right? And maybe not even just one or two, but there could be areas that you really need to have that cybersecurity posture kind of built up to be a little bit more robust. What else do you want to dive into just to, maybe put people at ease or to help them feel more secure, confident going forward to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the message I'd want to get to people is that it's a challenge every company faces. So the fact that you're not the only company that's going to face a challenge of having to manage vulnerabilities in your environment means that solutions have already been created that you can just follow. There are templates in terms of regular plans for putting the right steps in place that you will be able to read and work through and adopt. There are tools out there, many of which are part of most of the common software environments that most organizations are working in, that you can use to cover probably 80% of the vulnerabilities you're going to come across. And then there are tools that will make a typical company's job a lot easier in covering that last 20% of vulnerabilities. So it seems overwhelming at first, but I think you take it step by step, you work through those steps, you put those layers in place, and going through those processes will get you to where you feel really comfortable in your cybersecurity posture. And it doesn't have to be a scary process if you can just take it a step at a time.
So let's just talk about some real world examples. Will you just share with us maybe a past experience with a client where you were able to, one, identify, of course, a vulnerability and how they were able to implement procedure or policy to make it better and ultimately serve their clients better?
The most common thing that I think we see is patches like Windows updates and Microsoft updates. It's just like when your phone comes to you and says, I got to install an update tonight. Happens all the time on the servers too. And they're not getting all of them. And the reason is because they are relying on a tool to apply the patches, and they're not going back in there looking. And so I had one client, they had like 600 servers, and they probably had 30 or 40 that weren't regularly being patched. And so when we showed them this, they came to understand like, oh, this problem exists. Let's get to the heart of why and what we can do to prevent it. They put a few more steps in place. Now there's somebody who goes and they check every server, which sounds like it would be daunting, but it's actually really easy because they just wrote a script to get them a report out of all the servers. And they check them every month, and now they can easily find those outliers as easily as we did when we went and looked.
That's amazing.
And so we come back a year later and they don't have any issues when it comes to patching the servers.
Well, it's so interesting too, because for the most part, and in many organizations, you could argue that if 90% of everybody's doing something, that's a good thing, right? That's definitely an A, it's a passing grade. But here you have 600 servers, and it was 30 or 40. I mean, that is such a small number that's not kind of joined with the rest, and it just shows what a big impact it can still make.
Yeah, and it definitely can, especially if, of those 30 or 40, a couple of them were very critical servers, perhaps. And so companies also could take the step of deciding, like, what are the most critical ones, and we'll spend more time making sure that their vulnerabilities are managed, where maybe the less critical ones, less exposure to data that we're worried about, we pay a little bit less attention to.
Why is vulnerability management like one of your favorite topics of everything to cover in cybersecurity?
I was at a conference maybe 10 years ago, and there was a guy speaking, and he was attached to some component of the government. And I just remember him saying, if there were 3 things that we could get every company to do, and it would probably result in 80% less breaches. And those 3 things were educate users about how to be more safe with their computers, patch software, and change the initial passwords that came with their devices.
Wow.
And so I really zeroed in, as I started doing this work,
Yeah.
and I've been doing it for 5.5 years now, what I see most often is that there's software running and it hasn't been updated, and that means there's vulnerabilities in that network. And I don't know how to exploit those vulnerabilities, but I know that the people that the company's trying to keep out do. And so, each one of those holes, like a vulnerability here, and then an employee that clicks on a link, like that's all it takes for the attacker to get one step further into the network. And then once they're in there, perhaps they could spend months finding the next vulnerability.
If you had to look back on your career, and I know you've worked in IT and in this space for 25 years?
Yeah, about 25 years.
Wow, I mean, incredible. Is there like a time that you just felt really rewarded from seeking out those vulnerabilities and helping a client?
Yeah, it's definitely in this work I do, where I get to work with many different companies every year, that I felt the most fulfilled, because we do find those issues where there's a vulnerability. One company I was working with last year, they had to do a configuration in each server where they listed the name of the machine that was supposed to do all of their updating, except the name was commonly misspelled. Like it was a color. The color gray, and some people were spelling it Grey, and some people were spelling it Gray. And because they were mixing those up, half of the servers weren't getting updated.
Oh my goodness.
And it was one of those things where they had no idea it was happening, but it was an easy thing to find. And once they fixed that, all of a sudden, they were in a much better position to stand off attacks.
Okay, are you an AY or an EY kind of person?
Now, I did some research on this, and it's my understanding that Gray is a last name and Grey is a color. So that's what I think the answer to that is, but I could be wrong.
No, I'm so glad that we can put it to rest, because I was going to go EY. So I am right on.
You're right, that's the color.
Jeff, I just want to say thank you so much for sitting down with me. This was fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I had a good time.
Would you do it again?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again next time here in our cybersecurity mission.
Thanks so much.
When you work with a Kirkpatrick Price cybersecurity auditor, you work with someone who's been in your shoes. Let's see what the next expert is ready to share to support you in your cybersecurity mission.
Hello, my name is Aslan Kinsavage, and I work at Kirkpatrick Price as a penetration tester. One of my favorite topics in information security is vulnerability management. As a penetration tester, I see technical vulnerabilities all the time, and vulnerability management is where my technical findings intersect with business risk and daily business operations, and the triaging process and what technical vulnerabilities you address at a specific time. One resource I recommend for vulnerability management data is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They have resources and information about current attacks, current attackers, vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited, and resources for addressing those vulnerabilities. In addition, they have tools on their website for addressing those vulnerabilities and getting to know your environment better.
If you want to prepare for success with information security policies, visit kirkpatrickprice.com/podcast or the show notes to download today's episode resources. We're here to empower you to face your cybersecurity and compliance challenges. Are you ready to join a community of 10,000 people who are working together to elevate the standards for cybersecurity and compliance? It's free to sign up at kirkpatrickprice.com/podcast or check the show notes and achieve greater levels of assurance today. Thanks for joining us on our cybersecurity mission.